Olga sat in the dim light of the living room, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edge of the worn-out armrest of the couch. The house was silent, except for the faint ticking of the old clock on the wall, its rhythmic sound echoing in the stillness. It had been 3 years since Nikolai had passed away, but the emptiness that clung to the air in their home felt as fresh as the day he had been buried. Every corner of the house whispered his name: the kitchen where they had shared countless meals, the study where he had spent hours reading, the bedroom where their lives had intertwined so many times before the sickness came and tore him away. And now, every room seemed hollow, stripped of the warmth he had once given it. She stared at the family portrait hanging on the wall, her eyes tracing the familiar lines of Nikolai's face, the smile he had worn so often. She could still see his eyes, still hear his voice in her mind, but it wasn't the same. The memory of him was fading, blurring into something ungraspable, like mist slipping through her fingers. She missed him with a longing so deep it was almost physical, as though her heart were an open wound that refused to heal. At night, in the quiet of their bed, she could still feel his presence beside her, the warmth of his body, the way he used to breathe in his sleep. But when she reached out, there was nothing, just the cold emptiness of the sheets. Her tears had long since run dry, but the ache in her chest never seemed to lessen. It had become a constant companion, something she had learned to live with, but never truly accept. She had tried to fill the void in her life, tried to keep busy, but it never worked. Friends came and went, their well-meaning visits growing less frequent as the months passed. At first they called, they invited her out, they brought her flowers. But after a while they stopped calling. They no longer knew how to speak to her. They no longer knew how to help her find the woman she had been before. And she, in turn, had stopped reaching out. There were days when she couldn't even bring herself to leave the house, days when the thought of facing the world felt like too much. She had lost interest in everything. Work, hobbies, the small pleasures she once enjoyed, none of it mattered. What was the point of going through the motions when the one person she had shared everything with was gone? What was the point of anything at all? At times, she wondered if she would ever feel whole again. She hadn't even realized how much of herself she had given to him until he was gone. The years they had spent together felt like they had become one single, inseparable moment, each memory flowing into the next, each experience shared between them. It was difficult to fathom a life without him, without his steady presence beside her, without his laugh filling the empty spaces in their home. She couldn't remember what it felt like to be happy without him. All the things they had planned for the future, all the little dreams they had talked about, they had all died with him. The life she had imagined for herself seemed like a distant fantasy, a dream from which she had awoken to find herself alone, adrift in a world that no longer made sense. And then, one day, in the middle of her solitude, the silence was broken. It wasn't by the ringing of the phone or the knock of a visitor at the door, but by a sound that was both familiar and foreign at the same time. A soft whimpering, a gentle scratching at the door. Olga had never been one for pets, but after months of loneliness, she had found herself yearning for some form of companionship. She had gone to the local shelter half-heartedly, not knowing what to expect, and there, in the far corner, was a dog. He was old, with gray patches on his fur and a limp in his step, but there was something in his eyes that stopped her in her tracks. He looked at her as if he recognized her, as if he knew her in a way no one else did. Without thinking, she took him home. She named him Mishka, a name that seemed fitting for a dog who had known a lifetime of hardship. She didn't expect much from him, just a presence to fill the silence. But as days passed, she began to notice something strange. Mishka was always there, always at her side when she needed him most. When she sat in the living room, staring blankly at the wall, he would curl up beside her, his head resting on her lap, as if offering comfort in his quiet, non-demanding way. At night, when sleep eluded her, Mishka would lie on the floor by the bed, as if keeping watch, as if protecting her from the darkness. It was in those moments, when she felt the weight of the world pressing down on her, that Olga began to feel something stir within her. She wasn't sure what it was at first, a warmth, a tenderness that had been missing for so long. It was almost as if Mishka knew exactly what she needed, even before she did. He was patient with her, never demanding attention, never rushing her to heal. He simply existed beside her, and that for the time being was enough. She began to talk to him. At first out of habit, then out of a deep need to express the words that had been bottled up inside her for so long. She told him about Nikolai, about the love they had shared, about the ache that never seemed to go away. Mishka would listen, his eyes soft, as if he understood, as if he had heard it all before. One evening, as she sat on the porch watching the sunset, Mishka padded over to her and placed his head on her knee. For a moment she closed her eyes, and the world seemed to fade away. In the quiet of that moment, with only the sound of the wind in the trees and the distant chirping of birds, Olga felt something stir in her heart. It was as if a piece of her had been returned, as if the love she had lost was being gently restored, not in the way she had expected, but in a way she had never imagined. The connection between her and Mishka deepened. And though she knew he was just a dog, something in her heart told her that he was more than that. He was a presence in her life that she hadn't realized she had been missing. But even with that connection, Olga still couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. There were moments when Mishka would look at her, his gaze so intense, so knowing, that it made her heart skip a beat. He would tilt his head slightly, as if trying to tell her something, and in those moments she would feel a surge of emotion that she couldn't quite place. It was as if he could see her, truly see her, in a way that no one else had. She had seen that same look in Nikolai's eyes, that quiet understanding, that deep knowing. It unsettled her, but at the same time it comforted her. She found herself longing for those moments, as though they were a reminder of the love she had lost, a love that might still be present in some form. She didn't know what to make of it, but she couldn't deny that the dog was filling a void in her life. It wasn't the same as having Nikolai back, of course, but it was something. It was enough to make her feel less alone. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel something other than pain. A small spark of hope, a flicker of something that might someday grow into something more. But for now, she could only exist in this quiet, unspoken bond with Mishka, knowing that, in some strange and inexplicable way, he was the only thing that kept her from slipping completely into the darkness. Olga sat in the kitchen, the early morning light spilling through the windows and casting long shadows across the floor. The house was still, the air heavy with the weight of quiet. The coffee in her cup had gone cold, but she didn't mind. She wasn't really drinking it anymore, just holding it in her hands, the warmth of the mug offering a small comfort against the coldness inside her. It had become a routine of sorts, these mornings of solitude. She would wake up, make coffee, and then sit, listening to the silence, waiting for the day to start in its own slow, muted rhythm. There were no loud sounds, no bustling voices, only the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the house settling. Even Mishka, who was never far from her side, had settled into a kind of quiet watchfulness. But today was different. Today she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It started with Mishka, who had been lying by the back door, his head resting on his paws, staring out into the yard. He had been doing this more frequently lately, but today there was something about the way he was staring, something almost intent. His eyes weren't just blank or sleepy, they were focused, unblinking. His body was rigid, as if waiting for something. Olga noticed it first when she passed by him on her way to the kitchen. She paused, looking down at the dog, but his attention was so fixed on the door that he didn't even acknowledge her presence. It was unusual for Mishka, who had always been a laid-back, indifferent dog, more interested in being close to her than anything else. "Hey, Mishka," she murmured softly, kneeling beside him and running a hand through his graying fur. "What is it, boy?" He didn't move, didn't blink, didn't react at all. He simply stared ahead, his gaze unyielding, as though something out there was calling to him. Something she couldn't see. The odd sensation of being watched crept over her, and a chill ran down her spine. She stood up, shaking off the uncomfortable feeling, but she couldn't help glancing over her shoulder, as if expecting something to be standing just beyond the door, hidden from her sight. The yard was empty, the grass still wet from the previous night's rain, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. Nothing was there, but that feeling remained. She forced herself to shake her head, blaming it on too much time spent alone in the house. But the unease lingered. The day continued as usual, with Olga going about her tasks in the house, the weight of loneliness heavy in every room she entered. Mishka followed her from room to room, always within arm's reach, his presence a constant reminder of the life she had built around her grief. He had become her shadow in a way, always there, never demanding more than her attention when he felt it was needed. It was later in the afternoon, when the sun began its slow descent, that the next strange thing happened. Olga had gone out into the garden to water the plants, her back to the house as she focused on the rows of flowers. Mishka had been following her for the past half hour, trotting behind her with his familiar limping gait. But now, when she turned around, she froze. Mishka was standing by the door, his head tilted slightly, his body poised as if he were listening. Listening intently to something only he could hear. For a moment, the world seemed to go still. The birds had stopped singing, and the wind had died down. There was no rustling in the trees, no movement. The only sound was the soft, steady rhythm of her own heartbeat. Mishka, she called softly, her voice uncertain, as if asking him to confirm what she was seeing. But the dog didn't react. He was still, his eyes fixed on the door, and that same strange, knowing look had returned to his face. It was as if he was waiting for something or someone to come through that door. Olga's pulse quickened. She felt a rising panic that she couldn't explain. She stepped toward him, her footsteps slow and cautious. "Mishka, what's wrong?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Without warning, the dog turned sharply and trotted toward the door, pushing his nose against it with a soft whine, his tail held low. Olga reached the door just as he began to scratch at the wood, the sound of his claws dragging across the surface, sending an unexpected jolt through her. She reached for the handle, her hand trembling, unsure of what she was about to open the door to. There was nothing on the other side when she slowly pulled it open, only the empty yard, the trees swaying gently in the evening breeze, and the fading light of the day. But something felt off. She couldn't explain it, but there was a shift in the air, an almost palpable presence that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She closed the door quickly, feeling foolish, but the feeling didn't go away. The next few days were a blur of small, unsettling events that she couldn't fully comprehend. Mishka's behavior became more erratic, more insistent. He would follow her from room to room, his eyes locked onto her, as if he were waiting for something or someone. When she would sit at the kitchen table, he would sit beside her, staring at her face as though searching for something, searching for a part of her that had been lost, a part of him that had disappeared. The odd thing was, Olga couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't just waiting for her. He was waiting for someone else. There were moments when his gaze would drift to the doorway, or the window, as if he had heard something she hadn't. And every time she would glance in that direction, there would be nothing there. The house, once so familiar, now felt different. The silence was no longer just the absence of sound. It felt charged with something, something invisible but present. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows seemed amplified, as though the house itself was holding its breath. One evening after dinner, she was sitting on the couch, flipping through a book she hadn't read in years. Mishka was lying at her feet, as usual, his eyes closed, his breathing steady. She had almost forgotten the strangeness of the past few days when, suddenly, Mishka lifted his head. Slowly, deliberately, he turned toward the hallway that led to the bedroom. His body stiffened. His eyes narrowed, and for a long moment, he stared intently at the darkened hallway. It was as though he could see something she couldn't, something moving in the shadows. A cold chill gripped Olga's chest, and her breath caught in her throat. "Mishka," she whispered, her voice shaky. "What is it?" The dog didn't move, but his gaze never wavered from the hallway. He gave a low growl, so soft she wasn't sure if she had imagined it. It was the kind of growl that made the hair on her arms stand on end. She stood up slowly, her heart racing, and walked toward the hallway, her footsteps echoing louder than usual in the quiet of the house. But as she reached the threshold, the strange feeling disappeared. The hallway was empty, just as it had been moments before. No sounds, no shadows. But when she turned back, Mishka was no longer lying on the floor. He was standing, watching her with that same unblinking stare, as if he had known she would come. She felt a strange surge of fear rise within her, but there was no place to run, no place to hide. The dog's gaze was piercing, unwavering, and for the first time she realized that Mishka wasn't just a pet. There was something about him, something more, something familiar. The house fell silent again, but the unease remained, lingering in the corners, creeping under the floorboards, wrapping around her like a shadow. Whatever it was that Mishka was waiting for, it hadn't come yet. But it was only a matter of time. Olga had always been a woman of reason, a person who prided herself on making decisions based on logic and practicality. She had spent much of her life building a steady, predictable existence, one where emotions were kept in check, and nothing was allowed to stir the waters of her calm surface for too long. But in the months since Nikolai's death, she had found herself drifting further and further from the shores of that calm, caught in the churning tides of grief, confusion, and something she couldn't quite explain. At first, Mishka had been just a dog. A companion in the truest sense of the word, a creature that filled the silence, softened the sharp edges of loneliness. He was patient with her, never asking too much, never demanding more than the occasional scratch behind the ears or the warmth of a meal. He had arrived at a time when she felt most broken, when she was sure that no one could ever fill the void left by her husband. His presence had been a balm to her soul, offering comfort in small, simple ways. And she had accepted it, as one accepts the soft light of dawn or the familiar scent of home, something that simply was, without any need to question or analyze it. But as the weeks stretched into months, she began to notice changes in herself, subtle shifts that she couldn't ignore. The way her heart fluttered when Mishka curled up beside her in the evenings, how his presence beside her at the kitchen table had started to feel less like a distraction and more like something she couldn't live without. She had always been a woman of routine, and Mishka had slipped seamlessly into that rhythm. He would follow her through the house, his loyal eyes watching her every move, his soft paws making the only sound that broke the silence. There were times when she would turn around, and there he would be, waiting at the doorway, watching her as though he knew something she didn't. He would tilt his head slightly, and she would smile at the simple gesture. But there was something in those moments that made her chest tighten, something that unsettled her. The more she observed him, the more she began to feel as though he was not just a dog, but something more. Something connected to her in a way that she couldn't explain. At first, she dismissed the thought as absurd. He was just a pet, after all, a companion who had entered her life when she needed him most. But there were moments, fleeting and elusive, when she would catch a glimpse of something in his eyes that made her wonder. It was as though there was an understanding between them, an unspoken bond that transcended the typical relationship between a human and their dog. Mishka's gaze often lingered on her with an intensity that made her heart ache. It was the same kind of look she had once seen in Nikolai's eyes, the kind of gaze that seemed to see right through her, that understood her in a way that no one else did. And there were times when Olga found herself staring back at him, her breath caught in her throat, as though searching for something in his eyes. A connection, a presence, a spark of recognition that lingered just beyond the reach of her conscious mind. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky and the room was bathed in the soft glow of fading light, Olga sat by the window, her hands resting idly in her lap. She had been reading, but the words had begun to blur together in her mind, her thoughts drifting elsewhere. Mishka lay at her feet, his head resting on her shoes, his breathing steady and rhythmic. She could hear the faint chirping of birds outside, the rustling of the trees, but her attention was solely focused on the dog. There was something about him, something about the way he was lying there so still, that made the air around them feel thick, almost charged. She reached down absent-mindedly to scratch behind his ears, and his body tensed slightly under her touch. His eyes met hers then, and for the briefest moment she felt as though the world around her had stopped. It was not the usual look he gave her, the soft, content gaze of a loyal pet. No, this was different. This was a look that held a depth of emotion, a knowing, a familiarity that sent a shiver down her spine. His eyes seemed to pierce through her, as if he could see something within her that she hadn't dared acknowledge, something hidden deep inside. For a fleeting second, she wondered if he could somehow feel the pain of loss, the weight of grief that had been pressing down on her chest for so long. But the thought was too strange, too impossible, and she quickly pushed it away. Yet, the more time she spent with Mishka, the more she found herself questioning her own thoughts. It wasn't just the way he looked at her. There were other things she couldn't ignore. The way he seemed to understand when she was sad, when her mind drifted back to the past, to memories of Nikolai. On the days when she felt the loneliness creeping back into her heart, Mishka would be there, his body close to hers, his soft, comforting presence grounding her, reminding her that she was not truly alone. There were moments when he would nudge her hand with his nose, as if offering silent support, and she would find herself stroking his fur, her fingers trembling slightly, as though reaching for something she couldn't name. The emotional turmoil inside her grew, an ever-deepening wave of confusion and longing. She knew she had no right to feel this way. Mishka was just a dog, a good, loyal dog, but still just an animal. She couldn't deny the feelings that were stirring within her, however. She had never expected this. She had never imagined that her connection with a pet could run so deep, that the bond between them could mirror something so much more intimate, something more profound. And yet, every day it grew stronger. One night, as she sat on the couch, wrapped in a blanket with a book in her hands, Mishka climbed up beside her, nudging his head under her arm until she wrapped it around him. The gesture was so familiar, so comforting, that she could almost believe that this moment, this connection, was all there was. The world outside, with all its complications and troubles, faded into the background. In this moment, it was just her and Mishka. The steady rise and fall of his chest against her side, the gentle rhythm of his breathing lulling her into a kind of calm. But even in this peace, the questions remained. Was this real? Was it possible that the bond between her and Mishka was more than just the comfort of companionship? Was there something deeper at work here? She had begun to question whether Mishka's presence had become more than a simple act of fate. What if he was not just a dog? What if he was something more, something tied to Nikolai, something she couldn't understand? The thought made her uneasy. It was foolish, she knew that. It was a ridiculous idea, born from too much grief and too much time spent in the quiet, too much time with a dog who seemed to always be watching, always waiting. But the more she thought about it, the more impossible it seemed to ignore the pull, the strange connection that seemed to draw her to him. There were nights when she would wake in the dark hours, her mind racing with the possibilities, the overwhelming sense that there was something just out of reach, just beyond the veil of her understanding. Mishka would be there beside her, his body curled at the foot of the bed, his eyes wide and unblinking as he gazed at her. In the silence of those moments, it was as though the space between them disappeared, as though they were one, bound together by something ancient, something that defied explanation. The emotional turmoil that had been simmering inside her began to surface in ways she hadn't anticipated. She began to feel torn, caught between the love she had for Nikolai and the strange, growing attachment she felt for Mishka. There were moments when she would see him, the old dog with his graying fur and weary eyes, and she would feel an almost overwhelming wave of affection, of longing, as though a part of her heart, a part of her soul, was finding its way back to her. She would stroke his fur, burying her face in his coat, and for a moment it was as though she was touching something of Nikolai, something that had been lost, something that could never be returned. And yet, every time this connection deepened, the more it unsettled her. It was as though she was betraying herself, betraying the memory of her husband, by allowing this attachment to take root. But no matter how hard she tried to push it away, the connection between her and Mishka only grew stronger. It was as though the dog had become a reflection of everything she had lost, everything she had hoped to regain. He wasn't just a pet. He was a part of something much larger, something that she couldn't quite grasp but couldn't ignore either. As the weeks passed, Olga felt as though she were teetering on the edge of something that could either bring her peace or tear her apart. The emotional turmoil, once a quiet undercurrent of her life, had become a constant companion, pulling her in two directions. The bond she felt with Mishka was undeniable, but it came with an undeniable cost. She couldn't escape the growing feeling that somehow she was being pulled back into the past, into the arms of a love she could never truly replace, and yet, in some strange way, might be able to find again. Olga had never been one to put much stock in dreams. To her, they had always seemed like a fleeting mix of subconscious clutter, emotions and thoughts tangled together in the dark corners of the night. She had been practical all her life, a woman who trusted what she could see, touch and feel, who relied on the steady rhythm of reality to guide her through the days. But lately, her nights had become something else entirely. Each dream felt like a shadow, a presence slipping through the cracks of her waking life, leaving traces of something she couldn't quite grasp. The dream had started like any other. The room was dark, but she was not alone. There was the soft padding of Mishka's paws on the floor, the familiar sound of his breathing beside her. But tonight there was something different about it. It wasn't just the dream itself, it was the feeling that something more was happening. Something that couldn't be explained by the typical confusion of sleep. She had woken from a sound sleep, the weight of the blankets pressing heavily against her chest, and for a moment she felt disoriented, unsure whether she was still in the dream or if she had truly awoken. The room was still, but it felt wrong. The air was thick with an oppressive silence, and she could hear her heartbeat, steady and loud in the quiet darkness. As she lay there trying to calm her racing thoughts, she noticed Mishka beside her, lying on the bed as he often did, but tonight he was different. He was no longer the familiar dog she had come to know over the past months. He looked bigger, his form stretching unnaturally across the sheets, his body bathed in an eerie glow that cast strange shadows across the room. Olga tried to sit up, to brush the sleep from her eyes, but she couldn't move. Her body was frozen, as though her limbs were trapped in some invisible vise. A sense of panic rose in her chest, but she couldn't even cry out. She could only watch, helpless, as Mishka's eyes turned toward her. His gaze was no longer soft and familiar. It was piercing, as though he was seeing through her, as though he was looking into something far beyond her. And then, in that moment, everything shifted. The room seemed to dissolve around her. The walls blurred into nothingness, the bed beneath her turned into mist, and the floor gave way to a vast emptiness. She was no longer in her bedroom, in her house, in the quiet of her life. She was somewhere else, somewhere timeless, a place that existed in the space between waking and sleeping, a place that felt as though it had always been and would always be. It was a field of soft, undulating grass, stretching out beneath a vast sky that seemed to shimmer with light. In the distance, she could hear the faintest sound of running water, the gentle flow of a river she couldn't see. The air smelled of earth and rain, of something ancient and pure. And standing in the middle of it all, just at the edge of her vision, was a figure she knew all too well. Her heart skipped a beat, and her breath caught in her throat. The man standing there, his form bathed in the same strange, otherworldly glow, was unmistakable. He was tall, his hair dark and thick, his shoulders broad and strong. It was Nikolai. The same Nikolai she had known, the same Nikolai who had walked beside her through the years of their marriage. But there was something different about him now. He was not the man she had buried, the man who had slipped away so quietly, leaving only memories and grief behind. This was someone else, something more. She opened her mouth to call his name, but no sound came out. Her voice was lost in the stillness, swallowed by the vastness of the place. She tried again, but the words didn't form. It was as if she had lost the ability to speak altogether. And then, something shifted in the air, like the sudden shift of a wind that no one had noticed before. She looked down, and there, at her feet, stood Mishka. But it was not Mishka as she knew him. He was no longer the old dog with the graying fur, the loyal companion who had followed her through the days of her loneliness. Now, he was something else. His eyes glowed with the same ethereal light as Nikolai's, and his body, once small and unassuming, now appeared larger, more imposing. He stood tall, his posture regal and proud. His gaze, too, seemed to pierce through her, as though he could see the deepest recesses of her heart. In that moment, Olga understood. She understood without words, without explanation. The connection between her and Mishka, the bond that had been growing ever stronger, was not just a simple companionship. It was something far deeper, far older. Mishka was not just a dog. He was something else, something that existed beyond the physical, beyond the world of the living and the dead. He was a bridge between the two worlds, a messenger between realms. And in that moment, Olga realized that she was not simply mourning the loss of Nikolai. She was being shown something else, something she had never fully grasped. Nikolai's figure remained still in the distance, watching her with the same intensity that Mishka had. His eyes were full of love, but also of sorrow, of a quiet understanding. It was as though he was telling her, without words, that he had never truly left her. That he had been with her all along, watching, waiting, in the form of Mishka. The dog had come to her, not just to fill the empty spaces in her heart, but to carry something forward, something from him. A part of him, a piece of his soul, had crossed over into the form of this animal. It was not a coincidence, not an accident. It was a purpose. The realization hit her like a wave, and for a moment she thought she might drown in it. Her heart ached with a kind of bittersweet longing. The pain of loss mingled with the strange comfort of knowing that Nikolai had never truly left her. He had found a way to return, to make himself known to her in a form that she could understand, a form that would ease the loneliness of her days. As she stood there in the field, her heart heavy with emotions she could not fully comprehend, Mishka stepped closer to her. His glowing eyes never left hers, and in that moment it felt as though the two of them shared a single heartbeat. She reached out a hand, her fingers trembling, and Mishka nuzzled her palm with a gentleness that made her tears fall freely. She hadn't even realized she was crying until the first tear touched her cheek, but it wasn't sadness. It was relief. It was peace. The connection between them, once so confusing and overwhelming, now made perfect sense. Mishka had come to her not just as a companion, but as a messenger, a conduit between her world and the world beyond. He had brought her the comfort she had so desperately needed, the love she had thought she would never feel again. And now in this vision, this dream, she understood that it wasn't over. It would never be over. Nikolai's love, his presence, was with her always, hidden in plain sight, in the form of the dog who had come to guide her through the darkest days of her grief. As the vision began to fade, as the mist of the dream began to dissolve and the world of the living began to seep back in, Olga felt a peace settle over her. She wasn't alone. She wasn't alone. She would never be alone again. And for the first time in months, she felt something she hadn't felt in so long: hope. She awoke with a start, her body covered in sweat, her heart racing. But as the remnants of the dream clung to her like the last traces of a memory, she knew without question that what she had seen, what she had felt, was real. It wasn't just a dream. It wasn't just her imagination playing tricks on her. It was a message, a truth that had been whispered to her in the silence of the night. Mishka was still beside her, curled up at the foot of the bed, his eyes closed in peaceful slumber. But when she reached down to stroke his fur, she could feel the connection between them, stronger than ever. She knew now, with a certainty that filled her with both awe and sorrow, that the love she had lost had not gone. It had only changed form, had found a way to remain with her, to guide her. And as she lay back down, her hand resting on Mishka's back, she closed her eyes and whispered to the stillness, "Thank you, Nikolai. Thank you for finding a way to come back to me." The days after the dream were a blur, but they were no longer weighed down by the crushing weight of grief that had defined so much of her life since Nikolai's passing. There was something lighter in the air, something she couldn't quite explain but knew deep down was real. The connection she had felt with Mishka during the dream, the understanding, the bond lingered with her as though it had been etched into her very soul. She no longer saw him simply as a dog, as a companion who had arrived at a time of great loneliness. He was something more. A vessel, a messenger, a reminder that love didn't end when the body ceased to breathe. She had found herself in an entirely new place, one where the past and the present seemed to coexist in a way she hadn't thought possible. Olga woke each morning with a different sense of peace. The mornings, once filled with a void that no coffee or routine could fill, now felt like something she could look forward to. She no longer dreaded the silence, no longer wished for the company of something that wasn't there. She had learned to sit with the silence, to find comfort in it. It was as though the space between her and the world had softened, becoming more manageable. The quiet no longer felt empty. It felt full, as though it contained the possibility of something beautiful and meaningful. Mishka, lying beside her on the couch or curled up by her feet at night, was a constant, solid presence in her life. But it wasn't just the physicality of his form that comforted her. It was the deeper connection, the way she knew, without a doubt, that he carried within him something of Nikolai. That love had not vanished. It had transformed, like the seasons, like the river that ran through the forest, ever-changing but never-ending. It was this knowledge that began the process of her healing, though it was not immediate, and it was not easy. The acceptance of the new reality was a gradual unfolding, like the petals of a flower opening to the sun after a long, cold winter. There were moments when the weight of the past would rise up inside her, unexpected and sharp. The quiet ache of longing for Nikolai, the sharp pang in her chest when she caught a glimpse of their old photographs or passed by the place where they had shared their first kiss. It was those moments, those tiny fragments of sorrow that could take her by surprise, that she began to understand. The loss, the emptiness, had not disappeared, but it was different now. It was not an endless expanse of darkness, but a part of her life, a part of her story, a part of her. And the love she had once shared with Nikolai that had not vanished either. It had simply shifted like the wind that blows one direction before shifting course and finding another way. Each day she allowed herself to feel, to acknowledge those fleeting moments of sadness, but she also allowed herself to feel joy in the little things that had once been overlooked. The warmth of the sunlight filtering through the windows, the comforting smell of her morning tea, the sound of Mishka's steady breathing at her feet. These simple moments, which had once seemed trivial, now held great meaning. They were reminders that life continued, that life was beautiful in its quiet, unassuming way. That, though the road ahead would not always be easy, there was always something to be grateful for. At first she had feared that her connection with Mishka, her sense of Nikolai's presence through him, might diminish with time, but it had only grown stronger. The bond between them, once something tentative and uncertain, was now a steady, unwavering force in her life. She had stopped questioning it, stopped wondering if it was real, if it was possible. She had accepted it wholeheartedly, without reservation. Mishka had become a part of her healing process, not just as a reminder of what had been lost, but as a living, breathing manifestation of everything she had loved and still loved. The emotional walls she had built around herself, brick by brick, in the years following Nikolai's death, began to crumble. She felt lighter, more free to experience the world around her. She had long ago stopped measuring time in terms of grief, in terms of what had been lost and what would never be the same. Instead, she had learned to see time as a river that could carry her forward, that could still bring new experiences, new joys, even in the absence of the old. The pain of missing Nikolai was always there, but it no longer consumed her. It was a part of the fabric of her existence, a shadow that walked beside her, but not one that defined her. And in its place there was room for other things, room for love, room for acceptance, room for the new chapters she had yet to write. Her healing had not been linear. There were days when she still felt the old grief, the old sorrow that clung to her like a damp cloak. She would sit on the porch with Mishka beside her, watching the world go by, and the tears would fall, quiet and heavy. But now, when the tears came, they didn't feel like a sign of weakness or failure. They were simply a release, a way of honoring what had been, what was, and what would always be. Each tear, each moment of sadness, felt like an offering, an acknowledgement of the deep love she had shared with Nikolai, and a way of making space for the new love that was now part of her life. One afternoon, as the days began to grow longer, Olga stood at the edge of the garden, her hands resting gently on the railing of the porch. The sun had begun to set, casting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and the cool evening breeze rustled the leaves of the trees. She stood there for a long moment, allowing herself to feel the weight of the day's end, the stillness of the moment, the peace that had settled into her bones. Mishka stood beside her, his body close, but not demanding. He was simply there, a steady presence, as if to remind her that she was not alone, that she had never been alone. She had come to a realization, one that had been building quietly in her heart for weeks, that perhaps healing was not about forgetting the past, but about learning to live with it in a way that allowed her to move forward. She would never forget Nikolai. She would never forget the love they had shared, the life they had built together. But she had also learned to see that love not as a burden, not as something that had been lost to time, but as something that had woven itself into the very fabric of her life, shaping who she had become. She had not replaced him. She had not moved on in the sense that people often speak of. What she had done was different. She had found a way to live with the loss, to make peace with the absence, and to embrace the love that had not gone away. In Mishka, she had found something beautiful, something precious, not a replacement for Nikolai, but a continuation of the love they had shared. He had come to her at the right time, at the moment when her heart was ready to receive him, ready to be open again. And though she had not expected it, she had come to accept that sometimes love takes unexpected forms. Olga had spent so many years guarding her heart, afraid of the pain that love could bring. But now she understood something different. Love was not something that could be locked away, something that could be neatly contained. It was something that flowed, that moved and shifted, and that could always be found again, even in the most unlikely of places. She had learned to trust again, to trust that love would not abandon her, even when it had seemed lost. And she had learned that healing was not about erasing the pain, but about learning to carry it with grace, with acceptance. That evening, as the sky darkened and the stars began to emerge, Olga stood still in the garden, feeling a deep sense of contentment wash over her. Mishka was at her side, his presence a silent, steady reminder of the journey she had made. The night was quiet, and for the first time in a long time she felt the weight of her past transform, becoming something lighter, something that no longer held her captive. In its place she felt a quiet joy, a sense of peace that had been a long time coming. She had not been sure if she would ever be happy again. She had feared that the pain of loss would forever overshadow her life, that the love she had shared with Nikolai would be nothing more than a fading memory. But now, standing in the quiet of the evening with Mishka by her side, she understood something she hadn't fully grasped before. Love, like life, was never truly lost. It simply took on new forms, new expressions, and she had learned to see it in the most unexpected of places. And so, in that quiet moment, she accepted it. She accepted that healing would come in its own time, in its own way. She accepted that she could love again and that love could, in turn, heal her. And for the first time in a long while, Olga felt a sense of peace, a sense of belonging to both the past and the future, wrapped up in the present, with the love of Nikolai still within her heart, and the love of Mishka beside her. A few months had passed since Olga had fully embraced the idea that life, though it would never be the same, could still be beautiful, still be full of meaning. The mornings no longer felt like a battleground where she fought to find some sense of purpose, some reason to get out of bed. The days were still quiet, but now they were filled with a gentle rhythm, an undercurrent of peace that steadied her as she moved through them. Mishka, her loyal companion, had become not just a presence in her life but a beacon, a reminder that love didn't just fade into the past. It transformed, evolved, and found new expressions. The grief that had once consumed her now sat alongside her as a soft, distant echo. It was a part of her story, but it no longer defined her. Olga had begun to venture out more. A small act at first, nothing more than a walk through the local market or a visit to a nearby cafe. But with each step outside her door, she noticed how the world had begun to look different. The colors of the world were more vivid now, as if the light had shifted. Flowers in the gardens that lined the streets seemed brighter, more alive. The hum of life around her had softened, but it was still there, and for the first time in years she felt herself wanting to engage with it. She had always been a woman who thrived on routine, who found comfort in predictability. But now the idea of new experiences, new possibilities, no longer seemed daunting. They felt, in some strange way, like invitations to participate in a life she had almost given up on. It wasn't that she had forgotten Nikolai. Not at all. The love they had shared was still a bright, precious thing in her heart. She carried it with her, tenderly, as a secret part of herself. But it was no longer the anchor that kept her moored in a sea of sadness. It had become, over time, a foundation, something solid beneath her feet, something to build from. The grief was still there, woven into her life like a quiet thread, but it was now something she could carry with grace. And because of that, because she had made space for the love that had never left her, she was able to see the world with a new lens. Life, it seemed, still had much to offer. Mishka was always with her. Every morning he would nuzzle her face, his big, warm eyes staring at her with an intensity that, in some moments, felt like a challenge. He had always been an observant dog, but now there was something more. He seemed to understand her in a way that no one else could, her silences, her moods, her small, unspoken needs. He had become not just her companion, but her confidant, her partner in this new chapter of her life. His presence was a constant, and for the first time it felt right. It felt like it had always been meant to be this way. Olga had always been a solitary person, someone who preferred her own company, who thrived in the quiet, who found comfort in the mundane. But now, even in the stillness of her home, there was a sense of anticipation in the air. She had begun to think about what came next. about what her life could look like now that she had found a kind of peace. She had never been one to plan ahead, always content with what was immediately in front of her. But the idea of new beginnings had started to take root in her mind. She began to entertain the thought that maybe, just maybe, there was something more out there for her. Something that didn't diminish the love she had for Nikolai, but rather allowed it to coexist with something else. Something that could fill the spaces left empty by years of mourning. It started slowly. First, she began visiting the local cafe more often, sitting with a book or a journal and watching the world move around her. She didn't feel the need to speak to anyone, didn't long for conversation, but it was comforting to be around people, to observe their lives, their little moments of connection. She was beginning to find joy in the small things again, in the sound of the espresso machine steaming milk, in the chatter of people at neighboring tables, in the way the barista remembered her order each morning. It was a quiet kind of happiness, one that didn't demand anything from her, but simply asked her to be present. And for the first time in a long time, she was happy to be just that present. One afternoon, while sitting at the cafe, she saw a woman she recognized from the neighborhood. Her name was Irina, a friend of Nikolai's from work, someone he had often spoken of fondly. Irina had been one of the few people who had reached out to Olga after Nikolai's death, sending her flowers, offering her company. But Olga had never felt ready to accept it, too consumed by her own grief to accept the kindness of others. But today, as Irina approached her table, Olga felt something shift inside her. There was no longer the weight of the past holding her back, no longer the hesitance that had once kept her isolated. "Olga, is it really you?" Irina's voice was warm, surprised, but there was no pity in it. Just an open curiosity, an invitation. Olga looked up and smiled. It was a smile that came not from obligation, but from a genuine recognition. She had not expected to feel this way, but there was something comforting about seeing a familiar face, about feeling like she was being welcomed back into the world she had once been so disconnected from. "It's me," Olga said, her voice steady. "I've been hiding away too much, I think." Irina chuckled softly, pulling up a chair without asking. "We all need time, Olga. But I'm glad to see you out here. How have you been?" Olga took a breath, unsure of what to say. The truth was complicated: her grief, her healing, everything that had brought her here. But she didn't need to explain it all. Irina was simply there, offering her company, offering her a way back into the world. "I'm doing better," Olga replied after a pause. It's been a journey, but I think I'm finally finding my way." Irina nodded, as though she understood perfectly. She had always been a woman who moved through the world with grace, with an ease that Olga had admired from afar. But there was something different about her today, too. Perhaps it was the way she sat there, as if her presence was a reminder that life could still be lived fully, that it could still be rich with meaning even after loss. "That's good to hear," Irina said, her eyes softening. "I've missed you, you know. We all have. It's been a long time since you've let anyone in." Olga felt a pang of guilt for shutting people out, for not allowing herself to lean on those who cared for her. But that guilt was no longer as heavy. She had learned, over the past few months, that healing wasn't just about herself. It was about allowing others to be part of her journey, to be part of the new chapter she was beginning to write. As they sat there, drinking coffee and exchanging small stories, Olga realized that this was a beginning. It was the first step toward re-engaging with the world, toward reconnecting with the life she had once thought she had lost. It wasn't about forgetting what had come before. It wasn't about replacing the love she had for Nikolai. It was about expanding her heart, about making room for new relationships, new experiences, without erasing the old. The love she had shared with Nikolai was still a part of her, but now it was a part of a larger, richer story. Later that evening, as she walked home with Mishka at her side, she felt the shift within her more clearly than ever. The path ahead, though uncertain, was no longer a source of fear. It was full of possibility. She didn't need to know everything at once. Life, she understood now, was a series of moments strung together, small and sometimes insignificant, but always moving forward. She wasn't alone in it, not with Mishka beside her, not with the love she carried with her, and not with the new friendships that had begun to bloom in the cracks of her old sorrow. In her heart, there was still room for grief, but there was also room for hope, room for laughter, room for love. And so as she opened the door to her home, stepping inside with the quiet assurance of someone who had begun to heal, she knew that this was only the beginning. The next chapter was unfolding before her, and she was ready to write it.